She just wanted to buy a few groceries. But what happened next, no one could have expected. Who stood up when no one else would? Watch until the end. You won't believe who stepped in. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a powerful story. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? The fluorescent lights of the Dallas supermarket buzzed softly overhead as evening shoppers filed in through the automatic glass doors. It was the typical weekday rush. Parents grabbing last-minute dinners, office workers in loosened ties pushing carts of microwavable meals, and retirees scanning coupons with quiet determination. In the middle of it all, Maria Jenkins moved quietly through the produce section, a modest basket in her hand. She was a tall woman in her early 40s, her scrubs still on from her 12-hour shift at the city hospital. Her expression was calm but tired, the kind of exhaustion that came not just from the physical toll of work, but from years of carrying too much on her shoulders without complaint. She selected a loaf of bread, a small container of milk, and a few bananas. That was all she needed, enough for a light dinner and breakfast before her next shift. Maria never lingered in places like this. The longer she stood among the shelves and advertisements, the more invisible she felt. She made her way to the express checkout lane and waited patiently behind a man with a cart far exceeding the item limit. She didn't say anything. She never did. As she finally reached the cashier and placed her items on the belt, she gave a polite smile. The cashier barely looked at her, scanning the groceries mechanically. Maria paid with her debit card and accepted the receipt without a word. She placed the items back into her basket and began walking toward the exit. She didn't notice the eyes following her. Near the front of the store, positioned beside a customer service kiosk, stood Brent Carver, a former police officer turned supermarket security guard. His frame was bulky, more from age and stiffness than strength, and his posture suggested a man who still imagined he held authority far beyond his current role. His uniform shirt strained against his gut, and his fingers twitched when he saw Maria pass by. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she worked or how many lives she'd helped save. All he saw was a tired black woman in faded scrubs carrying a basket out of the store. And that was enough. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice sharp, commanding. "I need you to stop right there." Maria turned, startled, her brow furrowing slightly as she looked at the man approaching her. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone polite but confused. Brent didn't answer at first. He stepped directly in front of her, forcing her to halt near the sliding doors. Shoppers coming in gave the scene a quick glance, then kept walking. Some turned away deliberately. "I saw you in the aisle back there," Brent said, nodding vaguely toward the shelves. "I'm going to need you to open that bag." Maria blinked. "I paid for everything. You can see the receipt here." She held up the small slip of paper, the proof of her honest transaction. Brent didn't even look at it. "We've had a problem with theft lately," he said flatly. "Store policy is random checks. Now, open the bag." "There's nothing in my bag that I didn't pay for," Maria replied, still calm but now firm. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't argue. She simply stood her ground. Brent's face darkened. "Are you refusing to comply with store security?" "No," she said. "I'm saying you have no reason to detain me." He stepped closer, invading her space. "You want to make this difficult, huh?" Maria didn't move. "I just want to go home," she said. At that moment, several other customers stopped to watch, their curiosity piqued by the tension. A young couple whispered to each other, unsure if they should intervene. A woman with a child quickly walked past, pulling her daughter along. Brent reached out suddenly and grabbed Maria's wrist. "Sir," she said loudly now. "You're hurting me." "I said, open the damn bag," Brent snapped. Maria jerked her arm back, stumbling slightly as she tried to keep her balance. The basket hit the floor with a dull thud, milk and bananas tumbling out. The commotion froze the nearby shoppers. Several phones were pulled out. Cameras started recording. Across the store, by the refrigerated section, a man turned his head. He had been standing quietly, selecting a few apples and placing them gently into a paper bag. He wore a denim jacket and boots that had seen their share of dust. His beard was trimmed but weathered, his eyes calm but sharp. He saw the scene at the front unfold, saw the woman being manhandled, the security guard raising his voice, the fear and disbelief in her eyes. He set the apple bag down on the edge of the produce shelf and started walking. The cashier at lane 3 noticed him first. Her eyes widened. She nudged the bagger beside her and whispered something that made him glance up quickly. "No way," he muttered. That's him." Brent still had Maria's wrist in his grip. "You think you can talk back to me?" he hissed. "People like you always try to act like victims." "I said, let go," Maria replied, her voice shaken now, her arms straining. A low voice cut through the noise. "She told you to let go." Brent turned. The man standing a few feet away was calm, but his presence seemed to warp the air around him. Even the sliding doors behind him paused for a moment in their mechanical rhythm. Chuck Norris was not angry. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. But something in his tone made Brent release Maria's arm without thinking. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" Brent asked, adjusting his stance, trying to recover some of his authority. Chuck took a step forward. "Someone who doesn't like bullies?" Brent scoffed. "I'm store security. She showed you her receipt," Chuck interrupted. "That should have been enough." "She was acting suspicious." Chuck took another step. "No, you were." Brent's jaw clenched. "You want me to call the cops? You're interfering with the lawful detainment." Chuck didn't flinch. "You were roughing up a woman who paid for her groceries. I saw everything. So did half this store." Brent looked around. Several phones were pointed at him. No one was on his side. Maria had stepped back, nursing her wrist but watching with cautious hope. Chuck looked at her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head slowly. "I'm okay." Chuck turned back to Brent. "Then you're going to apologize, right here, right now." Brent sneered. "I don't owe her anything." Chuck's stance didn't change, but the space between them tightened like a coiled spring. His eyes narrowed just slightly. "Say it." Brent hesitated. Then, under the pressure of dozens of silent witnesses and the quiet weight of the man before him, he muttered, "Sorry." Chuck's voice was steady. "Louder." Brent's shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry," he said, this time loud enough for the whole store to hear. Chuck gave a small nod. "Now, go talk to your manager. Tell them everything you just did." Brent opened his mouth to protest, but something in Chuck's gaze silenced him. Without another word, Brent turned and walked toward the back of the store, red in the face. The silence broke into scattered applause. Someone near the bakery called out, "That was incredible!" Another voice chimed in, "Thank you, sir." Chuck didn't acknowledge the praise. He turned to Maria. "Do you need help getting home?" Maria looked at him for a moment, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes, not from fear but from relief. "I think I do." "Come on," Chuck said. "Let's get you out of here." Together, they walked toward the exit as the automatic doors finally parted for them, the cold evening air outside brushing against their faces. Behind them, the store buzzed with a different kind of energy now, one of justice, quiet and real. And this was only the beginning. The night air outside the supermarket was cool, a soft breeze brushing against Maria's face as she and Chuck Norris stepped into the nearly empty parking lot. The chaos of the store faded behind them, though its echo still lingered in her mind. Her wrist throbbed from where the guard had gripped it, and her heart beat unevenly as the adrenaline slowly drained from her system. Chuck walked beside her, silent for now, his steps calm and unhurried. He didn't ask if she was okay again. He didn't need to. Something in the way he carried himself brought a sense of safety she hadn't felt in a long time. Maria held her bag close to her chest, glancing over at him briefly, unsure how to even begin to express what she felt. They reached his truck, a black pickup parked a few rows down from the store entrance. He opened the passenger door for her and waited while she climbed in, moving with caution as she sat down. Only when he closed the door and walked around to the driver's side did she find the words to speak. "Thank you," she said quietly. Chuck settled into the seat and looked over at her. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his voice low and even. "He was wrong. Someone needed to stop him." Maria nodded, the corners of her eyes stinging. "It's just, people saw, and no one did anything." Chuck looked back at the store through the windshield. "They saw. They just didn't act. Until someone did." He started the truck, the engine rumbling steadily, and pulled out of the parking lot. For a while, they drove in silence. The roads were mostly clear at this hour. Street lights cast pools of golden light on the asphalt, flickering across the windshield in rhythmic intervals. Maria watched them pass, her mind drifting. She thought of the long day she'd had at the hospital, the patients she had comforted, the family she had called with bad news, the pain she had absorbed without letting it show. And then, to be treated like a criminal simply for existing, for shopping while black, was a cruelty that struck deep. She had faced this kind of quiet violence before, but tonight had been different. Tonight someone had intervened. "What's your name?" she asked finally. Chuck glanced at her. "Chuck," he said, "Chuck Norris." Maria blinked. "Wait, are you the Chuck Norris?" A faint smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. "I get that question sometimes." Maria let out a soft laugh despite herself. "Well, I guess that explains a lot." The truck continued forward, the streets growing quieter as they moved into a more residential area. "Where do you live?" Chuck asked. She gave him the directions, and he nodded, turning down the appropriate road. Back at the supermarket, things were changing quickly. The store manager had been called. Brent Carver stood near the customer service counter, his face flushed, his voice defensive as he tried to explain his version of what had happened. But too many people had witnessed the event. Too many phones had captured the moment he grabbed Maria, the way he dismissed her words, the way he ignored her receipt. A few customers had already sent their recordings to local news outlets. The assistant manager stood beside Brent, his arms crossed, watching the footage on one of the customers' phones. "This doesn't look good, Brent," he muttered. "You're not even supposed to touch customers, much less accuse them without cause." Brent's jaw clenched. "She was acting suspicious. She had a receipt," someone said behind him. Brent turned to argue, but stopped. The tide was turning, and he could feel it. He wasn't a police officer anymore. He didn't have the authority he once used to, and now, even in this small domain, his power was slipping away. The manager approached. "Brent, go home. We'll be conducting an internal review. You're suspended until further notice." Brent opened his mouth to argue again, but stopped himself. The eyes around him were not sympathetic. They were watching, judging, and some were still filming. Meanwhile, Chuck and Maria arrived at her apartment complex. It was a modest building on a quiet street, the kind of place where neighbors nodded politely but didn't linger. Chuck parked at the curb and turned off the engine. Maria looked at her building for a moment before turning to him. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea? Or water? I don't have much, but—" Chuck shook his head gently. "Thank you, but I should be going." She nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around the handles of her bag. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Chuck looked at her, his expression serious. "You shouldn't have to wonder about that. No one should." Maria stepped out of the truck, then paused, leaning down slightly to look back at him through the open door. "You're a good man, Mr. Norris." He nodded once. "Take care of yourself, Maria." She smiled softly, then closed the door and walked toward her building. Chuck watched until she disappeared inside before turning the key in the ignition once more. The engine growled to life and he pulled away from the curb, merging into the quiet street. Behind him, the night stretched on, but something in the darkness had shifted. Back at the supermarket, one of the videos had already gone viral. It had been posted with a caption, "Security guard assaults innocent woman. Chuck Norris steps in." Thousands of views poured in within minutes. Comments flooded the page. Some shared similar stories, others expressed outrage, and more than a few simply said, "That man picked the wrong fight." The story was no longer contained to one store in Dallas. It was spreading. And soon, the entire city would know what had happened. But for now, Chuck Norris drove through the quiet streets, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, ready for whatever came next. The following morning began with a firestorm. By sunrise, Maria's phone was already vibrating with messages from coworkers, friends, and even people she barely knew. Some had seen her name tagged in the video that had now surpassed 2 million views. Others had watched it unfold without realizing at first who she was, then reached out in disbelief once they made the connection. She sat at her modest kitchen table, a half-eaten piece of toast in front of her, staring at the screen of her phone. Her social media had exploded overnight. Dozens of strangers had sent messages of support. A few hateful comments had slipped in too, but they were drowned by a wave of solidarity. She had never intended to become the face of anything, but now her face was everywhere. She clicked play on one of the shared videos. It began just after Brent had grabbed her wrist, and she winced watching the moment replayed. Then Chuck's voice entered the scene, calm and measured. She watched herself step back, startled, and then watched as the man who had humiliated her was brought down with nothing but quiet resolve. The comments flooded past her eyes. Chuck Norris still protecting the people. This woman handled herself with dignity. No excuse for what that guard did. She put the phone down, her appetite gone. Across town, Brent Carver sat in his darkened living room, his phone forgotten on the table beside him. His TV was off, the blinds were drawn, a half-empty beer bottle sat in his hand. The previous day played on repeat in his mind. Over and over, he saw the moment the woman pulled away. The moment he reached out again. And then the voice. The man, Chuck Norris. He hadn't known at first, hadn't believed it. But when the crowd gasped and phones were raised, he realized who he was dealing with. And then the aftermath. The shame. The manager's cold stare. The news vans now parked outside his apartment. He hadn't opened the door since dawn. His phone buzzed. A message from a former colleague. "Man, you messed up big. Everyone's seen it." Brent didn't reply. He just stared at the floor, jaw tight, heart pounding with resentment and fear. He knew what was coming. His suspension wouldn't stay a suspension for long, and the police were already reviewing the video. At the Dallas Police Department, Lieutenant Harris stood at the front of the conference room, a paused frame of the supermarket footage projected behind him. Several officers sat watching silently as he pointed to Brent's actions. "This is excessive force," he said. "This is profiling, and this is a liability nightmare." A few officers shifted in their seats. "The store, a security uniform doesn't give him the authority he used here. But even if he were still active duty, this would be a problem." The room remained quiet. Harris let the silence stretch. "There are consequences coming," he added. "I want an official statement drafted by noon. This department will not be linked to his actions." Meanwhile, Chuck Norris was back at his modest home on the outskirts of the city. He sat on his porch, sipping coffee from a metal thermos, eyes following the gentle sway of trees in the wind. His phone buzzed occasionally, but he paid it little attention. The world could react however it wanted. He had done what was right. That was enough. A car pulled into the gravel driveway. It was Maria. She stepped out, dressed in fresh scrubs, her expression unsure but determined. Chuck set the thermos down and stood as she approached. "I just wanted to thank you again," she said, "but also to let you know what's happening." Chuck nodded once. "I saw." She hesitated, then added, "The hospital offered me a few days off, but I said no. I need to keep working. I won't let this change who I am." Chuck's eyes met hers, steady and respectful. "That's strength," he said simply. Maria smiled faintly. "I think some of that came from watching how you handled him. Calm, direct." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Chuck replied. "People don't expect calm. It disarms them faster than anger." They stood in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the countryside wrapping around them. Then Maria said, "They want me to speak to the press later. I'm not sure if I should." Chuck considered it. "Do what feels right, not what they expect. And don't let anyone rewrite what happened to fit their story." Maria nodded slowly. "I'll remember that." Later that day, Maria appeared briefly outside her building to address the growing crowd of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, but she spoke clearly, confidently. "What happened to me was wrong, but it wasn't just about me. It's about how people in power treat those they think have none, and how fast things change when someone refuses to let it go unnoticed." The crowd listened, most in silence. Some clapped. Her words struck a chord. In the days to come, the video would continue to spread. National news outlets would pick it up. Talk shows would invite her. Think pieces would be written about racial profiling, excessive force, and the unexpected reappearance of Chuck Norris as a protector of justice. But Maria didn't care about fame. She returned to her patients, to her long shifts and heavy work, with her head held a little higher. She had been seen. She had been heard. And Chuck Norris? He remained in the background as he always had, watching, waiting, ready to act again if the world gave him no choice. The evening sky in Dallas darkened slowly as the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the streets. In the newsroom of a local television station, editors worked hurriedly, piecing together clips from the now viral supermarket incident. The footage of Chuck Norris stepping in had taken the city by storm. Every major news outlet was covering the story, each offering their own take on what had happened between Maria Jenkins and Brent Carver. Commentators praised Chuck's calm intervention, while civil rights advocates pointed to the deeper systemic issue that had made such an intervention necessary in the first place. The public response was overwhelming. Hashtags trended on social media. Thousands had signed petitions demanding Brent's prosecution. Others began calling for improved training for security personnel. What had begun as a small confrontation in a local grocery store had grown into a citywide conversation. At the police department, Lieutenant Harris had been fielding nonstop calls. The internal review into Brent's actions had officially shifted into a criminal investigation. After reviewing several first-hand witness statements and the multiple video recordings that showed Brent aggressively grabbing Maria without cause, the department issued a formal statement condemning the incident. Brent Carver, while no longer a member of the Dallas PD, would still be facing charges. The district attorney's office had taken interest. By early evening, an arrest warrant was signed. Maria sat quietly on her couch as her living room filled with the flickering blue light of the evening news. She watched as her own face appeared on the screen, then faded to a shot of Chuck Norris helping her out of the store. Her phone buzzed again and again, but she ignored it, clutching a small pillow against her chest. She was grateful that justice seemed to be moving forward, but the attention exhausted her. She had always been a private person. Now her name was known across the city. Her story was being told by strangers. Still, deep down, she knew the importance of what had happened. The world had seen it, and it couldn't be ignored. In a quiet corner of town, Chuck Norris stood in the garage behind his house, surrounded by the scent of motor oil and old wood. He had taken the afternoon to work on his motorcycle, but his mind wasn't on the machine. It was on Maria, on Brent, on how close the situation had come to something worse. He had seen these kinds of encounters escalate before, too many times. The difference this time had been presence, action, the willingness to step forward. His movements were methodical as he wiped grease from his hands and set his tools aside. He knew the storm wasn't over yet. If anything, it was only gathering strength. Later that night, Brent Carver sat alone in the dim glow of his kitchen, the arrest warrant still unread in his email inbox. The knock on his door startled him. He hesitated, then peeked through the blinds. 2 uniformed officers stood waiting. He opened the door slowly, tension written across his face. Officer Ramirez, a woman he once shared a squad car with, met his gaze without emotion. "Brent Carver," she said firmly, "you are under arrest for assault and unlawful detainment." Brent didn't resist. He had no fight left in him. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he hung his head. The cameras outside the building flashed once again. News of the arrest spread quickly. By midnight, it was the top headline. Maria received a call from the DA's office informing her of the charges. They thanked her for her courage and asked if she would be willing to testify, should the case go to trial. She said yes, without hesitation. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she believed people needed to see it through. Justice only mattered if it was followed all the way to the end. The next morning, Chuck knocked gently on her door. Maria opened it, surprised but pleased to see him. He stood there with a small bag of groceries in hand. "Figured you could use a break from shopping for a while," he said. Maria laughed softly and stepped aside to let him in. They sat at her kitchen table, the sun rising slowly behind them, casting a golden light across the room. They didn't talk about the arrest. They didn't need to. It was understood. Instead, Maria poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs and asked, "You ever get tired of being the one who steps in?" Chuck took a slow sip and replied, "No, I get tired of needing to." They shared a quiet moment, 2 people brought together by injustice, but bound now by something stronger: respect, truth, and the understanding that standing up for what's right doesn't end when the cameras stop rolling. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters as the day of Brent Carver's arraignment arrived. Camera crews positioned themselves early, securing the best angles while journalists rehearsed their opening lines. It was no longer just a local story. National networks had picked it up, and now news vans from across the country crowded the narrow streets of downtown Dallas. Onlookers gathered behind barricades, some holding signs demanding justice, others simply curious to witness what had become a symbol of standing up against abuse of power. Inside the building, security was tight. Officers flanked the hallway as Brent was led through in cuffs, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Gone was the arrogance he once wore so confidently. His suit, though neatly pressed, couldn't disguise the tremor in his hands or the sweat collecting at his collar. Every step echoed through the corridor like a drumbeat of humiliation. Maria sat quietly in the gallery, flanked by a representative from the district attorney's office and a hospital co-worker who had come to support her. She wore simple clothes, nothing flashy, her hair pulled back neatly. Her presence commanded attention not through loudness, but through strength. When Brent entered the courtroom and saw her sitting there, he faltered for a second before straightening his shoulders. The judge entered, and all rose. The proceedings began. The prosecution laid out the charges with precision: assault, unlawful detainment, and racial profiling. They cited multiple video recordings, eyewitness accounts, and Brent's history of complaints filed during his time on the police force. Though none of the previous complaints had led to disciplinary action, they painted a picture of a man who had repeatedly overstepped his bounds. The defense argued that Brent had been doing his job and misjudged the situation in the heat of the moment. But the evidence was overwhelming. Video showed Maria presenting her receipt. Audio captured Brent's dismissive tone, his refusal to acknowledge her words, and, most damning of all, the moment he physically grabbed her. Then came Chuck Norris. Though Chuck did not appear in court that day, the footage of his intervention was played for the judge. The courtroom fell silent as the video unfolded on the screen. The sound of Chuck's calm voice, the firmness in his presence, and the crowd's reactions carried more weight than any legal argument. The moment Brent shoved Maria and Chuck stepped in was like a line drawn in time, a boundary that had been crossed and then swiftly corrected. The judge set a date for trial and denied the defense's request to dismiss the charges. Brent was released on bail but ordered not to leave the city. As he exited the courtroom under the weight of flashing cameras and shouted questions, he kept his head low. There was no statement, no apology, only silence. That afternoon, Maria walked out of the courthouse with her head held high. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended, questions flying in rapid bursts. She paused only once to say, "I'm just glad the system is doing what it's supposed to do." Then she kept walking. Her focus was not on the cameras, not on the press, but on getting home. She had another shift that evening at the hospital. Her patients were waiting. Meanwhile, Chuck stood outside a small community center a few miles away. He had agreed to speak to a group of young people about self-defense and responsibility. Not because of the publicity, but because it mattered. As he stepped inside, the room quieted. Dozens of eyes turned toward him, Some wide with admiration, others filled with curiosity. Chuck nodded once and began to speak. He didn't talk about fighting. He talked about awareness, about courage, about doing the right thing even when it's uncomfortable. You don't need to throw a punch to stop a bad situation, he said. Sometimes you just need to stand up and speak. That's what makes the difference. His words settled over the room like quiet thunder. No drama, no ego, just truth. Later that night, Maria received a call from a young woman who had been at the store that day but hadn't stepped in. The woman apologized, said she should have said something. Maria told her, "You can't change what happened, but you can decide what you'll do next time. That's what matters." The call ended with both women in tears, not of pain, but of clarity. Across the city, the story continued to ripple. Schools discussed it. Churches mentioned it in sermons. Community leaders used it as a rallying point for reform. A moment of injustice had become a movement. And at the heart of it stood Maria, unwavering, and Chuck Norris, silent but ever present. The man who had reminded everyone that real strength is measured not by how loud you are, but by how firmly you stand when others don't. The day of the trial arrived under an overcast sky. Heavy gray clouds hovered above the Dallas courthouse, casting a muted light over the city below. The streets around the building were once again lined with media vans and clusters of reporters. Pedestrians paused to take photos as police redirected traffic and courthouse security prepared for another crowded session. The atmosphere was tense but focused. Inside the courtroom, every seat in the gallery was taken. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters opened notebooks, and the quiet buzz of conversation dropped to a hush as the bailiff called for order. Brent Carver entered through a side door escorted by officers, his suit sharp but his posture heavy with the weight of weeks spent under public scrutiny. He took his seat at the defense table without looking at the audience. Maria entered moments later. She walked with calm determination, her head high, her steps measured. She took her seat near the front, a quiet sense of resolve radiating from her. There were no tears on her face, no trembling in her hands. This moment had been coming for weeks, and she was ready. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. Opening arguments were delivered. The prosecution was deliberate and confident, highlighting Brent's past disciplinary record, the video evidence, and the growing pattern of misuse of authority. The defense attempted to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, claiming that Brent had reason to suspect shoplifting and that his actions, while regrettable, had not been malicious. Maria was called to testify. The courtroom was silent as she stood and took the oath. On the stand, she spoke with clarity and grace. She recounted her day at work, how she had only stopped at the supermarket for a few essentials, how she had paid for everything and kept her receipt. She described the moment Brent stopped her, his tone, his words, and how quickly things escalated. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't falter. When asked how she felt, she paused only a moment before answering. "I felt invisible," she said. "Like nothing I said mattered. Like I didn't belong. But I do belong. And I knew I had done nothing wrong." The defense attorney pressed her, attempting to catch inconsistencies, but Maria's account remained firm. The jury watched her closely. They listened, and they believed her. When the footage was played again, now part of official evidence, the courtroom watched in silence as Brent's actions were displayed frame by frame. The sound of him grabbing Maria, her clear attempt to show her receipt, the aggressive tone in his voice. And then Chuck Norris appearing, calm but unshakable. The video ended with Brent's forced apology and retreat. Chuck was not required to testify. His statement had already been submitted and accepted as part of the record. Still, his presence in the gallery drew murmurs when he entered halfway through the session. He sat quietly near the back, arms folded, eyes fixed on the front of the room. He was there not for attention, but for Maria, and she knew it. Closing arguments were delivered the next day. The prosecution reminded the jury that this case wasn't just about a confrontation. It was about accountability, about the misuse of power, about what happens when someone assumes authority gives them the right to humiliate others. The defense asked for leniency, claiming that Brent had already suffered public humiliation and that jail time would be excessive. The jury was sent to deliberate. Hours passed. Maria waited in the hallway, seated beside her attorney. Chuck stood nearby, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. Neither of them spoke much. The building buzzed with movement, but around them was stillness. Finally, the bailiff called everyone back. The jury had reached a verdict. Inside the courtroom, the air was tight with anticipation. Brent's hands fidgeted beneath the table. The jury foreman stood. The verdict was read aloud. Guilty on all counts: assault, unlawful detainment, use of excessive force. A quiet gasp moved through the gallery. Brent closed his eyes and lowered his head. The judge thanked the jury and then addressed the court. Sentencing would occur the following week, but Brent was immediately remanded into custody without bail. Officers moved toward him, and as the cuffs were placed on his wrists, he didn't resist. The finality of the moment hung heavy in the air. Outside, the crowd had grown. When Maria exited the courthouse, dozens of people clapped. Some cheered softly. Cameras flashed, but she didn't stop. She made her way to the sidewalk where Chuck waited beside his truck. She walked up to him and gave a small, tired smile. "It's done," she said. Chuck nodded. "Justice doesn't fix everything," he said, "but it makes a start." They stood together in the late afternoon quiet as the crowd buzzed behind them. Maria looked up at the sky. The clouds had begun to break, and a thin shaft of sunlight filtered down between the buildings. It was not a perfect day, but it was something. The days following the verdict brought a strange kind of peace to Maria's life. The media storm gradually faded, replaced by new stories and shifting headlines, but those who had followed her journey did not forget. People approached her in the hospital corridors not just to congratulate her, but to thank her. Nurses, janitors, patients, even doctors, some of whom had never spoken to her before, stopped to say how proud they were of her strength. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't want the spotlight. All she had ever wanted was to be treated with dignity, and now that she had stood up for it, others found the courage to do the same. The case had awakened something across the city. Community meetings were organized to address how stores train their security. Local leaders began holding forums on racial profiling. The mayor even made a brief public statement, calling the incident a reminder that accountability and justice must be expected, not requested. Chuck Norris, as always, remained in the background. He had never sought recognition and declined every interview request that came his way. When a national network offered him a primetime feature, he simply said no. His work, as far as he saw it, was done. He returned to his quiet routines, his training, his long walks through the hills outside the city. But his presence lingered in the story, not as the center of it, but as the line that had been drawn. The man who had refused to let power crush the powerless. His legend, already built on strength and fearlessness, now had something even deeper attached to it: decency. Brent Carver was sentenced to 2 years in state prison and 3 years probation. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke clearly and without emotion. "You violated the trust of the position you held, and you acted on prejudice, not reason. This court cannot allow such behavior to go unanswered." Brent had no supporters in the room. No applause followed the ruling. He was led out of the courtroom without ceremony, his figure small and unremarkable beneath the weight of consequence. On the day of his sentencing, Maria did not attend the hearing. Instead, she spent her morning walking through the city park, the same one near the supermarket where everything had started. The sky was clear, and children's laughter echoed from the nearby playground. She sat on a bench beneath a tall oak tree, her hands resting in her lap, her thoughts still and quiet. She didn't need to see the end to know that it was over. Chuck arrived without announcement. He simply appeared beside her, a quiet presence, his hands in the pockets of his jacket. Maria turned to him unsurprised. "It's strange," she said, "how something so small can become something so big." Chuck nodded. "Big things usually start that way." They sat in silence for a while. The world moved on around them, slow and peaceful. Finally, Maria said, "I've been thinking of starting something, a program, for women who've been through things like this, maybe teach them how to speak up, how to stay calm, how to protect themselves." Chuck looked at her with a small flicker of approval in his eyes. "That's a good idea." "You'd help?" she asked. He nodded. "Of course." Weeks later, flyers for the new program began appearing across the city. Community centers, libraries, and schools pinned up announcements. The response was immediate. The first session was packed, and Maria stood at the front of the room with a calm strength that silenced the crowd. She shared her story, not as a victim, but as someone who had chosen to speak when silence would have been easier. When she finished, Chuck stepped forward to join her. He didn't say much, just a few words about courage, about knowing when to stand, and about never letting fear decide who you are. The applause was quiet but sincere. It wasn't the sound of celebration, it was the sound of respect. As the sun set behind the city skyline, Maria stood at the window of the community center and looked out at the streets below. She didn't feel afraid anymore. The world was far from perfect, but people were waking up. Change had started, and it would keep going. Because now they knew someone was watching. Someone who didn't need a badge to bring justice. Someone who had reminded them what it meant to care. Chuck Norris stood at her side, his silhouette steady in the fading light. They didn't need to speak. They had already said everything that mattered. Justice was served, but the message goes far beyond one moment. What would you have done? Let us know in the comments. If this story moved you, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real stories that matter. And before you go, tell us where in the world you're watching from.